The year is 1916. The location is the Somme River in France. The morning mist is hanging low over the trenches, but the silence is a lie. Behind the British lines, a logistical miracle has taken place. For weeks, the railways have groaned under the weight of freight trains carrying a singular cargo, death, packed into steel cylinders. There are 3 million artillery shells stacked in dumps that stretch for miles. This was the moment the world realized that war was no longer an art, it was an industry. Napoleon Bonaparte once famously said, "God fights on the side with the best artillery." But even Napoleon could not have imagined the scale of what was about to happen. On June 24th, the order was given. In an instant, the horizon did not just light up, it caught fire. Over 1,500 British guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound was something human ears had never heard before. It wasn't a series of individual explosions. It was a continuous, solid wall of noise. The Germans on the receiving end had a specific word for it. Asterisk. Trommel for asterisk. Drumfire. It sounded like a giant drummer beating a roll on the skin of the earth. A low, vibrating roar that could be heard as far away as London, nearly 300 miles across the English Channel. For the German soldiers huddled in their deep bunkers, the times Stalin times the experience was the closest thing to hell on earth. Imagine sitting in the dark, 30 feet underground. The earth around you is not just shaking, it is convulsing. The vibrations are so intense that the candles flicker out. You cannot speak to the man sitting next to you because the noise is deafening. You cannot sleep. You cannot eat. You simply sit, hugging your knees, waiting for the ceiling to collapse. This bombardment did not last for an hour. It did not last for a day. It continued without a single second of silence for 7 days and 7 nights. The British fired over 1.5 million shells in that single week. The goal was to annihilate the German defenses, to cut the barbed wire, and to bury the enemy alive. It was a storm of steel rain designed to erase everything on the surface. When the guns finally stopped, the landscape had changed. Forests were gone, replaced by splintered toothpicks. Villages were reduced to brick dust. The green fields were churned into a gray, cratered moonscape. This was the introduction of the god of war in the 20th century. It taught the soldiers a brutal lesson. Personal bravery no longer mattered. You could be the greatest marksman or the bravest hero, but you could not fight a 100-pound, high-explosive shell fired from 5 miles away. Artillery had become the supreme killer of the battlefield, responsible for 70% of all casualties in the war. The steel rain didn't just kill men. It dehumanized them, turning them into statistics in an industrial slaughterhouse. To understand the horror of World War I artillery, you must first understand that for thousands of years, warfare was defined by solid objects piercing human flesh, arrows, swords, and bullets. But in 1914, the world introduced a new way to die: physics. When a high explosive shell detonated, it didn't just throw metal, it manipulated the very air we breathe. The soldiers in the trenches called it the red mist. It was a phrase whispered with a sick kind of reverence. It described a phenomenon that defied the laws of nature as they understood them. When a heavy caliber shell, a 9-inch or 12-inch monster, landed directly in a crowded trench bay, the release of energy was so absolute that the human bodies within the blast radius didn't just die. They were atomized. The heat and the pressure wave vaporized flesh and bone instantly, turning men into a fine crimson spray that coated the mud walls. Survivors would often write letters home stating that their friend was missing in action because there was literally nothing left to bury. The shell had erased them from existence. But for those just outside the center of the blast, the fate was perhaps worse. This was the domain of shrapnel. Unlike high explosive shells, shrapnel shells were designed to function like giant airborne shotguns. They were filled with hundreds of lead balls. When they exploded overhead, they rained down iron hail. But it wasn't just the balls. The casing of the shell itself shattered into jagged, razor-sharp shards of hot steel. A bullet makes a clean hole. Artillery shrapnel does not. It tears. Surgeons in field hospitals were horrified by the wounds they saw. A piece of spinning, jagged iron would strike a man's leg, taking with it the dirty trench mud and the fabric of his uniform, twisting it deep into the muscle and bone. The infection rate was catastrophic. Men didn't just die from the trauma. They died because their bodies were turned into open wounds filled with the bacteria of the battlefield. Then there was the silent killer, overpressure. You could be sitting in a deep dugout, safe from the shrapnel, safe from the direct hit. A massive shell lands outside the entrance. You aren't touched by a single piece of metal. You don't have a scratch on you, but you are dead before you hit the floor. The shockwave generated by these massive explosions moved faster than the speed of sound. When this wave hit the human body, it passed through solid muscle, but it wreaked havoc on hollow organs. The sudden, violent change in atmospheric pressure would rupture the lungs and turn the brain into liquid inside the skull. Patrols would often find men sitting in bunkers, still holding their cards or their cigarettes, looking perfectly peaceful, as if they were asleep. But their insides had been destroyed by the concussion alone. This was the true horror of the steel rain. It stripped the human body of its dignity. It turned soldiers into biology experiments, showcasing how fragile we are against the power of industrial chemistry. It didn't just kill the enemy, it dismantled them, leaving the survivors to walk through a landscape painted in blood, trying to keep their sanity while the air itself tried to kill them. There is a limit to what the human mind can endure. In the medical journals of 1914, it was a mystery. By 1916, it had a name: shell shock. To understand why men broke, you have to understand the nature of the endless thunder. In previous wars, battles lasted hours. In World War I, a bombardment could last for weeks. Imagine a thunderstorm. But every clap of thunder is an explosion capable of tearing a house apart. And it happens every 3 seconds, day and night, for 10 days straight. For the soldiers trapped in the dugouts, the torture wasn't just the fear of death, it was the deprivation of sleep. The constant concussion of the heavy guns vibrated through the soil, shaking the very teeth in their heads. It turned the ground into a drumhead. Men would lie in the dark, hands over their ears, but the sound traveled through their bones. After 3 or 4 days without sleep, the line between reality and nightmare dissolved. The true horror of artillery was its impersonality. In a bayonet charge, you have a chance. You can parry, you can shoot, you can run. You have agency. But under an artillery barrage, you are helpless. You are a rat in a cage. There is no enemy to shoot. There is only the mathematical probability of a shell landing on your coordinate. This total lack of control destroyed the psyche. The bravest men, decorated heroes who had stormed machine gun nests, would suddenly collapse, weeping uncontrollably, shaking so violently they could not hold a cup of water. Commanders initially called it cowardice. They threatened to execute men who couldn't stop trembling. But soon, the medical officers realized this was something new. The nervous system was physically shattering under the pressure. The symptoms were terrifying. Men lost the power of speech. They went blind, despite having no injury to their eyes. They developed a distinctive, stiff-legged gait. And then there was the face, the 1,000-yard stare. It was a look of total emotional detachment, eyes wide and unblinking, looking through you, past you, seeing nothing but the horror they couldn't escape. The trenches themselves became part of the madness. As the shells churned the earth over and over, the living were forced to coexist with the dead. A shell would explode and unearth the bodies of friends buried yesterday, flinging them into the shelter where the survivors huddled. Men were buried alive, dug out, and then buried again an hour later. For many, the breaking point wasn't the noise, it was the silence. When the guns finally stopped, the silence was so heavy, so unnatural, that men would scream just to fill the void. The artillery didn't just break their bodies, it broke the fundamental belief that the world made sense. It created a generation of ghosts who, even after they returned home to the quiet countryside, would dive for cover at the sound of a slamming door, forever trapped in the endless thunder of the Somme. By 1916, the generals had realized a bloody truth. Destroying the enemy trenches wasn't enough. As soon as the shelling stopped, the Germans would race up from their deep bunkers, set up their machine guns, and slaughter the infantry crossing no man's land. To solve this, the British artillery developed a tactic that was both brilliant and suicidal. They called it the creeping barrage. To the soldiers standing in the mud at dawn, waiting for the whistle to blow, it looked like a magic trick from hell. The plan was terrifyingly precise. Thousands of guns would fire simultaneously, creating a solid line of exploding shells just a few hundred yards in front of the friendly troops. Then, on a strict schedule, usually every 3 minutes, the gunners miles away would raise their sights by a fraction of a degree. The result was a wall of death that moved. It was a literal curtain of fire and churned earth marching forward across the battlefield at a walking pace. The infantry was given a horrifying order: lean into the barrage. This meant they had to walk as close to the exploding shells as possible, sometimes as close as 50 yards. The logic was cold and mathematical. If you stayed close to the wall of fire, the German defenders would still be keeping their heads down. You could be on top of them before they could man their machine guns. But this tactic required a level of trust that borders on insanity. The infantrymen were walking into explosions caused by their own friends. They were putting their lives in the hands of a gunner 5 miles away, praying his math was perfect, praying his gunpowder was dry, and praying his watch was synchronized to the second. The horror of the creeping barrage was the short round. Artillery barrels are made of steel, but they are not invincible. As a battle raged and guns fired thousands of rounds, the barrels would heat up and warp. The rifling inside would wear down. A worn-out barrel meant the shell wouldn't fly as far as the math predicted. Veterans of Vimy Ridge in the Somme described the sickening feeling of walking forward and watching the wall of death drift backward toward them. They would see their own comrades, men they had eaten breakfast with an hour ago, suddenly vanish in a pink mist, disintegrated by a British shell that fell 50 yards short. But they couldn't stop. That was the nightmare of the tactic. If the line halted because of friendly fire, they would lose the protection of the barrage. The wall would move on without them, leaving them exposed in the open field for the German machine gunners. So, the officers screamed at them to keep moving. They had to step over the bodies of men killed by their own side, walking steadily into the roar, trying to stay close enough to the fire to survive, but not close enough to die. The creeping barrage turned the battlefield into a clockwork slaughterhouse. It removed the chaos of battle and replaced it with a terrifying, rhythmic march. It was a wall of noise so loud that men couldn't hear their own screams, a wall of dust so thick they couldn't see the sun. It was the ultimate expression of industrial warfare, a machine that moved across the land, grinding everything in its path to dust. And the humans were just fuel to keep it moving. When the guns finally fell silent on the 11th of November, 1918, the world celebrated the end of the war to end all wars. But along the 450-mile scar that cut across France and Belgium, the war did not end. It simply went underground. To say the artillery damaged the landscape is an understatement. It murdered it. In places like Verdun and Passchendaele, the geography was literally erased. The millions of shells fired had pulverized the ancient drainage systems that had kept the lowlands dry for centuries. When the rains came, the battlefield turned into a thick, viscous soup of liquid mud. It was a landscape where the ground itself became a weapon. Thousands of men didn't die from bullets, but suffocated, drowning in shell craters filled with slime, dragged down by the weight of their own gear. But the artillery left behind a legacy far darker than just mud. It left behind the iron harvest. During the war, British and German factories were churning out ammunition at a desperate pace. Quality control slipped, It is estimated that nearly 30% of all shells fired millions upon millions of tons of explosives failed to detonate. They thudded into the soft, wet mud and were swallowed whole by the earth. They didn't explode. They waited. Today, more than a century later, the war is still rising to the surface. Every spring and autumn, in the quiet fields of Flanders and the Somme, tractors ply the earth to plant corn and potatoes. And every year, the farmers hear the sickening clank times of steel against steel. The soil pushes the old munitions up, rejecting the foreign metal. This is the iron harvest. It is a grim, seasonal ritual. Farmers casually stack rusty, mud-caked 18-pounders and German Jack Johnson shells by the roadside, like sacks of garbage, waiting for the bomb disposal trucks to collect them. It is a mundane routine, but a deadly one. Since the armistice, hundreds of people, farmers, construction workers, and disposal experts have been killed by these rusty echoes of 1,917. The shells are often leaking. Some contain high explosives that have become unstable with age. Others contain mustard gas or phosgene, the liquid inside, still sloshing around, as deadly today as the day it was bottled. There are parts of France known as the time zone Rouge times, the red zone, where the damage is so absolute that the government simply gave up. The villages that once stood there were never rebuilt. The land is legally quarantined. The soil contains such high levels of arsenic, lead, and unexploded ordnance that it is deemed impossible to support human life for perhaps another 300 years. In these forbidden forests, the ground is still pockmarked with craters, looking like the surface of the moon covered in moss. Trees struggle to grow because the roots hit layers of steel. The god of war may have left the heavens in 1918, but he poisoned the earth before he left. The iron harvest is the chilling reminder that while treaties can end a conflict between nations, they cannot heal the wounds inflicted on the world itself. For the soil of France, the Great War is still happening, one rusty shell at a time.